Bill King is with us from Nashville Sports Radio, and we appreciate him pushing the segment just a couple of minutes here. Bill, how's your Wednesday going?
Doing well, guys. Appreciate it.
Is dominance by Alabama? That's 2 years in a row. You've had other dominance in the national championship game. Could you imagine what Devontae Smith would have done with the second half? I mean, 215 yards in the first half, 12 catches in the first freaking half. Was that the greatest performance you've seen in national championship history, or are there other ones like Vince Young that you can think of at the top of your mind?
Well, I mean, if we narrowed it down to positions, that's about as good as you're going to see a wide receiver, for sure. As far as just individual performances in games, yeah, I mean, 05, Vince was Superman, as we recall. We can pull those up. I'm sure we can find somebody on that 95 Nebraska team that annihilated Florida to praise too. But yeah, I mean, and here's the other thing. I don't know what Kerry Coombs, who was the defensive coordinator at Ohio State, is thinking, but they're out there chasing Smitty with slow linebackers. Mm-hmm. I don't know what they were looking at on film, but that had to be the worst game plan I've seen in a big moment.
Well, so much of what we talk about matchups goes into the matchup on the field, but the matchup of the minds is what you're getting at here. And it seems that in this case, Ryan Day and his coordinators weren't quite ready for primetime the way that Nick Saban and the best assistant coach in football right now, or who's no longer an assistant because Sark took over, I think, last night at Texas. They just weren't up to that task.
No, Sean Wade, who was their best returning DB, had actually briefly opted out and then opted back in. And his dad was one of the really big vocal people to the whole time maintain the Big Ten needs to be playing when they were canceled. But he probably should have stayed out. He had a poor year, and he had a very rough night as well. I think that's going to hurt his draft stock. He's probably a borderline first-rounder coming into the season. He won't be now. So, yeah, that was an interesting game. I thought it would be high-scoring, but I thought it would be relatively close. I think I said Alabama 35-31. So it was more one-sided than I would have thought.
So now looking ahead, I mean, you lose Smith, you lose Waddle, Harris to the NFL, Mac Jones too, and we always assume that there's always another star in the making that's waiting behind him, and you and I had spoken quite a bit about Bryce Young the last couple of years, and it's going to be his team moving forward. But are we safe to assume that Alabama is supposed to be the favorite next year too?
Right there, yeah. Bryce Young is a dual threat point guard. In basketball terms, he can score 20, or he can dish out 15 assists. He can do both in basketball terms, and he's got a big arm. His only issue is he's 6 foot maybe, but he's dynamic. They are deep, and they had a good recruiting class at running back. And guys, you've got to remember, they had just yesterday Jerry Jeudy and Henry Ruggs playing with Smitty and Waddle. Okay, that's the last 2 years. Just the last 2 years, which is obscene. And I don't know if there's somebody as dynamic as that group, but they'll be good at receiver. You know that. They've recruited well there, too.
So now there's talk of Bill O'Brien being the next Alabama offensive coordinator, and now it's sort of like, coaching staff shuffle season, and interesting to see Kevin Steele go to Tennessee as the defensive coordinator. I know he played there under Johnny Majors, and the staff that Brian Harsin is building for a guy that doesn't have any SEC experience. Boy, Harsin's bringing in a coaching staff that is all SEC experience.
Yeah, I mean, Bobo and Mason, offense and defensive coordinators, and Will Friend on the offensive line. I heard it sounded like Tracy Rocker, which is Kumar Rocker's dad,
right, is
heading back to Auburn. It sounds like there was a report. I haven't confirmed it, but it wouldn't shock me. And they'll keep Rodney Garner. Rodney Garner is Mr. Auburn. He will always be there. So, yeah, it's pretty good-looking staff.
As far as the LSU staff is concerned, I know Jake Pete's the offensive coordinator. I think he worked with Brady with the Carolina Panthers. Is it safe to assume that they're trying to get exactly back to the fire that they caught with Brady as the passing game coordinator now?
Yeah, that's going to be tough. I mean, you had Joe Burrow ended up playing so well. He's the first pick in the draft. You had those receivers led by Jamar Chase that were just phenomenal. And you had a first-round draft pick at running back. So it's going to be hard to get back to that. They'll be Max Johnson, as we saw late, last couple of games, really played well. Was true freshman. So it looks like they got the quarterback. And they made a run at the hottest coordinator out there, Marcus Freeman. And Friday of last week, it really looked like he was heading to LSU. He told some colleagues he was. And he'd already interviewed prior with Notre Dame. Well, Notre Dame came back and got it. Kind of a 180 reversal last Friday. That was a decent-sized blow to them because he is, again, the biggest name, most coveted coordinator out there. And he's also a very good recruiter, dynamic recruiter. He'll be a head coach. Marcus Freeman will probably no later than 2 years from now.
Last thing I want to ask as far as the coaching carousel is concerned, I've seen where a writer for the Knoxville News had posited that the hiring of Kevin Steele as the defensive coordinator at Tennessee is a little bit of a warning to Jeremy Pruitt because he finished second to Pruitt in the hiring for that job to begin with, and he is a former Tennessee Volunteer. And Tennessee, the university, has hired an outside lawyer to investigate some of the dealings inside Jeremy Pruitt's football program. Now, we've asked you this question a few other times throughout the season, but here it's the off season, and it just seems that the hot seat remains under Jeremy Pruitt, and it might be even hotter than it was before.
It's confusing, and I'll lay it out to you, the Cliff Notes. Kevin Steele is a good buddy, pretty good buddy of Pruitt's. They were at Alabama together, okay? But Kevin Steele, who was a walk-on at Tennessee from South Carolina, and then was a GA early on, and then was hired later in the 80s to be DB coach, knows Fulmer and has kept in touch with Fulmer. And a couple of years ago when the big cluster bleep, which was the Tennessee search, after all the rejections and they wouldn't let him, the administration wouldn't let him hire Mike Leach, they had him hired. And Steele was one of the finalists, along with Mel Tucker and Jeremy Pruitt. And as we know, Pruitt got the job. So you've got a lot of loyalties there, and I'm not sure what to believe. It looks like Steele might have been brought in as a, quote, defensive assistant. First of all, remember, guys, we were told they were under a hiring freeze.
Right.
Couldn't hire, and just all of a sudden, now they hire somebody. So it looks like if something happens to Pruitt, maybe they've got Steele in place to take over, maybe as an interim, or maybe as the head coach, and you've still got the Hugh Freeze item, because I think it's pretty obvious Hugh Freeze wants that job. And then the other alternative would be Jeremy Pruitt keeps it another year. It's really mixed up right now.
Bill, appreciate you, man. It really does sound like almost a game of Clue over there in Knoxville. Well, we'll be talking about some more stuff like that next week.
Okay.
Appreciate you as always.
Thank you.
It's Bill King from Nashville Sports Radio. Yeah, and he mentioned Tracy Rocker, who was the defensive line coach at South Carolina, maybe taking the same job at Auburn, which means that he will have worked then at Auburn, South Carolina, Tennessee, Arkansas, I think another SEC school or two, and then his son is going to be the first pick in the Major League Baseball draft. That's Kumar Rocker's son, who is about as unhittable as anybody in the college game. And we'll be able to get into some college baseball with Bill, because the two sports he specializes in on his show, college baseball and college football. I'd say football gets about 85% of the topics there. All right, we're going to come back, wrap it up with Change My Mind.